This is very much a pilot episode, and I will most likely redo it in the future with any fan requested changes, but in order to do that I will need feedback from you, my loyal subjects, or disloyal depending on if you've managed to miss the subscribe button or not. All stats, hobbies and the like will be information from the Shinobi syllabus, which came with the Let's Get Physical edition of Shinobi Versus and the Estival Versus databook, and is accurate to the publications of both of those. I will mainly be talking about the characters' appearances in the 3D games, those being Shinobi Versus, Estival Versus and somewhat Burst Renewal, but that game's pretty awful, so I'll avoid it as much as I can. Anyway, for our first exploration of the Senran girls, and I don't mean sexually, we'll be talking about one of the most popular in the series since its conception, and that is Ikaruga. Ikaruga is a third year student at the Hanzo National Academy along with Katsuragi, which would be considered her first rival when starting her shinobi training, besting her in nearly every fight, thus establishing her discipline for the shinobi arts, which is in direct opposition to Katsuragi, which comes across as somewhat amateurish. If anything, this sets the stage for their relationship throughout the series, one being serious nearly all the time and the other being a sexually harassing loony. Ikaruga has a strong sense of pride and discipline. This discipline can be a result of her being adopted into her current family after their biological son Murasame turned out to be pretty goddamn terrible at ninja arts, being a joke character featured in Senran Kagura 2, but it's also a result of receiving special lessons as a consequence or perk of being adopted into the Hou family. However, being adopted into such a high-ranking shinobi family has given her much responsibility, as they are funders of the Hanzo National Academy, and being granted their treasured sword Hein, I can't pronounce Japanese words that well, but it is her current weapon and sword. This is a position as well that has given her 3 of her 4 rival characters, the previously mentioned Murasame, who's soundly defeated in one of those long dialogue scenes that makes the games feel like a book rather than an action game, Murakumo, who's at odds with her because of her history of being part of the rival Tyro Corporation, much like Xbox and PlayStation fans hate each other for liking or disliking a certain piece of technology those sad cunts own. And then there's Yomi, who is the opposite for having nothing essentially and being unlucky in life, while it goes without saying Ikaruga is the opposite. This rivalry runs deeper though because their designs are at odds as well, with Ikaruga's design being very Eastern and somewhat similar to a Japanese Royal Guard, whilst Yomi has a somewhat Western design, probably Germanic in origin, I don't know, I've never been there. This even runs deeper because their weapons are designed in that way as well, with Yomi having a giant greatsword which is more of a traditional Western weapon, whilst Ikaruga has a long Eastern sword. Ikaruga is also class president, not that there's ever any proper classes or lessons shown in the games, but regardless, that's what she is. The role is, however, somewhat shown in her Shinobi girl's heart, in Shinobi Versus at least, where she disciplines various other characters for the way they dress, which wouldn't come as a surprise as she's a bit of a prude, being the character with the least amount of skin showing, that being only her head not being covered in clothes. However, she is the character that does end up naked as a poor result of her actions, like the previously mentioned scenario where she battles the other girls for their dress code, but as a result of the battles this means her own clothes end up little more than the tissues that fanboys use to wank over her with. Another scene is when she has to strip down to nothing in order to outpower President Haruka as her alter ego BC mask in her Estival Versus Shinobi Girl's Heart. BC or KP mask as it's called in the Japanese versions of the game, as well as the game audio referring to it as KP mask. I have no idea why they changed it, but anyway, KP, BC mask, whatever, is an extension of Ikaruga's personality, as they both uphold justice and wanting to do the right thing no matter how small, be it wanting people to eat fruit and vegetables, stopping other characters acting as villains, or as her real self, stopping the other Hanzo girls into pissing about during the Kagura Millennium Festival. So onto the gameplay. Now, just as a note here before I get into this section, most of the information will once again be from the Shinobi syllabus, which seems to think the games have the same depth as, fighting games, which they clearly don't, as well as the databook for Estival Versus, which I can't get fully translated by one of my friends that studied Japanese in exchange for sex, but because of the lockdown I obviously can't do that. That's just a joke. it was in exchange for hand jobs. Anyway, take some of this with a pinch of salt. Most people have their own way of playing the games and the characters. Like, for example, I never really used the lock-on feature. But anywho, in terms of the game series, she is considered a speed type character. Depending on the game, her stats may vary. Not by much, however, a slight level out in her stats for Estival Versus, so her attack and defense are closer than they were in Shinobi Versus. The general rule though is she has relatively lowish health and defense, which makes her somewhat of a glass cannon, but what she lacks in endurance she more than makes up for it in physical speed and attack speed, which in this series makes some characters easier to play because they're able to deal out more damage per second and don't get too overwhelmed, which is a fair trade for health and defense being low with speed, because if you can't get hit, then it doesn't matter how low your health is it? While she does have quick attacks, in Burst and Estival, this does only apply to her weak attacks, whereas some of her strong attacks, you know, the ones that lead into the aerial raves, are relatively slow, mainly the ones later in the attack chain, leaving her open to enemy counters, such as this attack where she does a strike from side to side, down, and then causes the razor wind thingamabob to appear. This does leave her fairly vulnerable, but like most of her attacks, it does have a very wide reach. As you may see on screen, most of her attacks do this, where she extends her arms to both sides whilst attacking, giving us such a wide arc of attack, which is incredibly good against crowds of enemies, which is the most effective way of using Ikaruga. Not that she's bad in one-on-one fights with her incredible speed. This more than makes up for the slowness of those few attacks. Now in Shinobi Versus, it's slightly the opposite. Her late strong attack is quick, but has virtually no reach or arc on it, only attacking directly enemies in front of her. While most of her attacks have changed animations between the games, they still fulfill the same purpose. Early strong attacks are quick to launch other playable characters into the air, while the later ones are more effective against medium to light enemies. Against heavier enemies, example the bears or the fat bitches in Burst, the best tactic is actually just to spam weak attacks, but never finish the chain and then rinse and repeat, because if you finish the chain, it leaves you with this long attack where she resheaths her sword, and that leaves you fairly open, especially if they want to do that stupid body slam cuddle thing on you. The only real change to her attacks in the series have been the first strong attack, or breach art as the game calls them. In Shinobi Versus and Estival Versus, holding down the button will cause her to launch a series of projectiles straight in front of her, enabling her to damage ranged enemies, although it's kind of pointless when her dash is so fast that she can close the gap on foes pretty quickly. It is, however, best used against those turtle enemies when they're spinning about like Beyblades. However, in Burst Renewal, this attack has been changed to sort of disappearing in midair and then doing an upward strike. So I can't really say either are bad, because they sort of cover a weakness. Anyway, so are Ninpous now. Ninpous across all of the 3D games, as I'll call them, they remain relatively the same, with the exception of the ultimate, but then everyone's ultimate changed during the jump of the games being average to great. The cheapest of her Ninpous, Heiin Hosen Mode 1, yes that's what it's called, and the others aren't actually called Heiin Hosen Mode 2. Ikaruga slashes her sword horizontally, turns her back to the enemy, and then sheaths her sword, causing a razor-like wind to appear behind her. This will launch them into the air briefly and cut them up, causing minor damage in a small area, but is fairly good as a disrupting attack. Her second Ninpou, Ikaruga turns around, proceeds to unsheath Heiin, slashes horizontally whilst turning, creating blue flames and summoning her Phoenix Guardian Animal. Guardian Animals, which are never mentioned outside of Shinobi Versus for some reason, which flies towards, damaging anyone in its path before flying into the air and disappearing. It deals constant damage whilst in contact with the enemies, as well as having a chance to cause the fire status effect, which will cause damage over time on those enemies. However, if this move is done inside or near a wall, this Ninpou won't do much damage at all, because obviously it's got to clip through the wall. So in Shinobi Versus, our ultimate, much like all of the ultimate Ninpous in the game, feature the use of the character's guardian animal, of which Ikaruga's is a blue phoenix. The attack itself is a series of back and forth slashes, which is incredibly lame compared to some of the attacks we get later in the series. Her ultimate Ninpou, however, in Burst and Estival Versus, which I don't know the name of, She unsheaths her sword by flinging it into the air. With her sword now held vertically in both hands, she imbues it with her power before doing a vertical strike down, forming a beam of energy that strikes anything directly in front of her with quite long range, but only in a very thin line, so there's quite a chance enemies will move out of the way. With that in mind, its sole purpose is to be used against bosses and does rather poorly when surrounded. However, I've noticed some splash damage coming off enemies hit directly in the laser's path. There we go, my friends. Like I said, this is a pilot episode. I will no doubt redo this sometime, but with that said, I did talk about doing videos like this 3 years ago or whenever Shinobi Versus got a PC release, and I never did it until now because I'm lazy. But you know what, if people would like me to do more and eventually cover all the girls, give this video a like. Let me know in the comments if you liked it and what aspects of the characters you'd like to see in the future, and if this video does well, I'll do more. Thank you very much, and I'll see you later, masturbators.